All right, so today we're going to be looking into something that's, well, frankly, a little scary. It's been in the news a lot lately, and there's definitely reason to be concerned. Yeah, we're talking about bird flu and the potential for it to, become a pandemic. And we're going deep today. We've got a whole stack of sources here, news articles, scientific papers, even some government documents. And we really want to get a clear picture of just what's going on with this H5N1 virus.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this is that it's not like some distant threat. Like this thing is already out there. H5N1 is circulating globally, and it's showing some pretty worrying characteristics.
Yeah. One of the things I was reading that was really alarming was that it could be way deadlier than COVID-19. And I think for most of us, we're not virologists. So can you break it down for us? Like, what exactly is avian influenza, and why is this H5N1 strain so concerning?
Okay, so avian influenza, you probably know it better as bird flu. It's a type of influenza virus that mainly affects birds. Now, H5N1, this is a specific subtype that's highly pathogenic. What that means is that it can cause really severe illness. And if you compare the mortality rate to something like COVID-19, which was around 1%, H5N1 in humans, we're looking at estimates as high as 30 to 50%.
Wow. Okay, so that's a huge difference. I mean, that's definitely something to pay attention to. And it's not just birds anymore, right?
Right, exactly. We've seen these outbreaks popping up in other mammals too, mink, foxes, even sea lions. And the fact that it's showing up in cattle here in the US, that's particularly concerning. It kind of suggests that the virus is adapting in ways that could make it easier to jump to humans.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that leads me to this study that came out of Scripps Research recently. They found this mutation in H5N1, and it seems like it could allow the virus to bind more efficiently to human cells. I mean, that sounds like kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal. Essentially, you can think of this mutation as like a key that helps the virus unlock human cells. And that makes it easier to infect us. Now, the good news is it hasn't been widely detected out in the wild yet, but the fact that it's even possible, it just shows how close we could be to a pandemic situation.
Okay, so we've got this potentially deadly virus spreading among animals. It's showing signs of adapting to mammals. And we know that human infections are happening. This is starting to feel like, one of those doomsday scenarios. So I'm curious, was there anyone who was trying to, prepare for this kind of threat before it became such a big news story?
Yeah, actually, there was. Back in 2019, President Trump, he issued an executive order. It was all about modernizing the U.S. influenza vaccine infrastructure. And a big focus of that was moving away from traditional egg-based vaccine production, which is really slow and can be unreliable. And instead, the focus was shifting towards faster, more adaptable technologies like cell-based and recombinant vaccine manufacturing.
That's pretty forward-thinking for 2019. It sounds like they were already recognizing some of the limitations of the systems we had in place.
Exactly. They understood that in a rapidly evolving pandemic situation, we'd need to be able to develop and manufacture vaccines quickly and on a large scale.
Okay, well, that's good to know. But vaccines are more for prevention, right? What about treatments for people who actually get sick? Weren't there some issues with monoclonal antibodies during COVID-19?
Yeah, you're right. The COVID-19 pandemic really exposed a weak spot in our healthcare system, and that's the monoclonal antibody supply chain. So these are lab-created proteins that basically help our immune system fight off infection. But they were in really short supply during the peak of the pandemic. I mean, the U.S. Army supply chain even expressed concerns about having to ration them.
Wow, so it sounds like we really need to figure out how to produce these treatments faster and more cost-effectively. Are there any companies out there working on solutions for this?
There are, and one company that really stands out is Dyadic International. They've developed this protein production platform called C1, and it has the potential to completely change how we make monoclonal antibodies.
Okay, C1, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this platform. What makes it so promising?
Well, it's based on a fungus, and it has some major advantages over traditional methods. First of all, it's way faster. We're talking developing stable cell lines for antibody production in as little as 21 days. It's also scalable, so you can get high yields of antibodies using a simpler and more cost-effective process.
So potentially faster, cheaper, and more efficient. It sounds like they're addressing the exact issues that we ran into with monoclonal antibodies during COVID. Is anyone else recognizing this potential?
They are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, actually.
Yeah.
They recently gave Dyadic a $3 million grant to develop affordable monoclonal antibodies for RSV and malaria using this C1 platform.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So it's not just about bird flu. This has applications for other diseases as well.
Absolutely. This C1 platform is incredibly versatile, and it could be a total game changer in how we approach a whole range of infectious diseases.
Okay, this is all great, but I really want to hear about their specific work on H5N1. What are they doing to address this potential bird flu threat?
Well, they're tackling it on multiple fronts. One thing they're doing is developing a C1-produced antigen for diagnostic tests, and that could help us quickly identify H5N1 infections.
Right, and that's crucial for tracking the spread of the virus. What about on the vaccine front?
They're working on that too. They've partnered with a company called ViroVax, and they're developing a ferritin nanoparticle H5 antigen. So basically, they're creating a vaccine candidate that's specifically designed to target H5N1 in different species, including humans.
Oh, so it's like a One Health approach, recognizing the connection between animal and human health. I like that. What's the latest on their progress?
Well, they've done some early trials with poultry, and the results have been really positive. The next step is to conduct larger-scale trials in poultry and then potentially other animals like cattle.
Okay, so it sounds like they're still in the early stages, but moving in the right direction.
They are, and a big advantage of this C1 platform is its adaptability. They can quickly test different vaccine formulations and modify them based on the data they're getting back. And that flexibility is absolutely essential when you're dealing with a virus that's constantly evolving.
That's a great point. So they're not just developing vaccines, though, right? Dyadic is also looking at using C1 for monoclonal antibody production, and that could be really critical for treating severe H5N1 infections.
Absolutely. Like we were saying earlier, monoclonal antibodies are essentially these lab-created proteins that mimic our natural immune response.
Yeah.
And they can be really effective in treating a lot of diseases, including potentially H5N1. But the traditional ways of producing them are expensive and they take a lot of time.
Right, and that's where the C1 platform could really make a difference. It could offer a faster and more cost-effective way to produce these treatments that could potentially save lives.
Exactly. It could make monoclonal antibodies much more accessible to people who need them. And that would be a major step forward for global healthcare.
So basically, Dyadic is coming at this H5N1 threat from both sides. They're focusing on prevention with vaccines and treatment with monoclonal antibodies. And all of this is powered by this incredible C1 platform.
Yeah, it really is remarkable. I mean, just think about it. One technology that could potentially have such a huge impact on our ability to respond to this emerging threat.
It really highlights the potential of biotechnology and how important it is to support research and development in this field. But as we've been discussing, it's not just about the science. It's also about policy resources and global cooperation. And that brings up an important question for our listeners.
It does. The question is, will we learn from the mistakes we made during the COVID-19 pandemic? Will we take the steps we need to take to be better prepared for the next pandemic, whether it's H5N1 or something else entirely?
Yeah, that's something we'll be exploring further in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll be discussing the broader implications of Dyadic's work and what it means for the future of pandemic preparedness.
Do you want a deep dive podcast like this? Contact Bull Run by Charlie DeVanzo.
So we just finished talking about some of the really innovative work that Dyadic International is doing with their C1 protein production platform. And it seems like they're really pushing the boundaries when it comes to, developing vaccines and treatments.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that their work is coming at such a critical time. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic, it really exposed just how fragile our global health systems are. And the traditional methods for producing vaccines and antibodies, well, they were just too slow and too expensive, especially when we're facing a brand new virus.
Yeah, and we're still dealing with the consequences of that, right? Like all the supply chain issues and unequal access to vaccines. It just shows that we need a more effective approach for the future.
Exactly. And that's where Dyadic's C1 platform could really be the solution we've been looking for. The speed, the scalability, the cost effectiveness. It could revolutionize how we respond to infectious diseases, including H5N1. Imagine being able to develop and distribute affordable vaccines and treatments really quickly when a new threat emerges.
I mean, that would be incredible. But are there any potential downsides or challenges with this technology? It almost sounds too good to be true.
Well, of course, with any new technology, there are always challenges. One of the biggest hurdles is regulatory approval. Dyadic will have to prove to organizations like the FDA that their C1-produced vaccines and antibodies are safe and effective.
Right, and that approval process can take a long time, can it?
It can, although there are ways to expedite it during emergencies, like during a pandemic. But another challenge is manufacturing capacity. Even with a platform as efficient as C1, scaling up production to meet global demand, Well, that's a complex and expensive undertaking.
So it's not just about the science then, it's also about having the infrastructure in place to actually produce and distribute these treatments effectively.
Exactly. It requires a lot of cooperation between governments, industry leaders, and research institutions.
You mentioned earlier that Dyadic is collaborating with ViroVax on their H5N1 antigen. Can you tell me a little bit more about that partnership and why it's so significant?
Sure. So ViroVax, they bring a lot of expertise to the table. They specialize in developing these things called ferritin nanoparticle vaccines. And they've shown a lot of promise in early studies. Ferritin nanoparticles, they're incredibly stable and they can display multiple copies of an antigen, which means they can be really effective at triggering a strong immune response. So combining their expertise with Dyadic's C1 platform, well, it creates a really powerful synergy for developing a targeted and effective H5N1 vaccine.
So they're kind of taking a two-pronged approach, then combining the benefits of both technologies. That's really interesting. What's the current status of their work on this H5N1 vaccine?
Well, they've completed some early trials with poultry, and the results so far have been positive. The next step is to conduct larger-scale trials in poultry and then possibly other animals like cattle.
Okay, so it sounds like they're still in the early stages, but they're moving in a promising direction.
They are, and again, a big advantage of the C1 platform is that it's so adaptable. They can test different vaccine formulations quickly, and then they can modify them based on the data they're getting back from the trials. And that flexibility is essential when you're dealing with a virus that's constantly evolving.
Right, that makes sense. So it's not just vaccines though, right? Dyadic is also looking at using their C1 platform for monoclonal antibody production. And that could be really important for treating people who have severe H5N1 infections.
Absolutely. As we discussed earlier, monoclonal antibodies are these lab-created proteins that basically mimic our natural immune response. And they can be very effective in treating a lot of diseases, potentially even H5N1. But the problem is that traditional production methods are expensive and time-consuming.
And that's where C1 comes in. It offers a much faster and more cost-effective way to produce these treatments that could potentially be life-saving.
Exactly. It could make monoclonal antibodies much more accessible to people who really need them, and that would be a major step forward for global healthcare.
So Dyadic is really addressing this H5N1 threat from both sides, prevention with vaccines and treatment with monoclonal antibodies, and it's all powered by this one innovative platform.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. One technology that could have such a profound impact on how we respond to this emerging threat.
It really highlights the power of biotechnology and how important it is to support research and development in this field. But as we've been talking about, it's not just about the science, it's also about policy resources, global cooperation. And that brings up a really important question that I want our listeners to think about.
And that is, will we learn from the mistakes we made with COVID-19? Will we take the steps we need to take to be truly prepared for the next pandemic, whether it's H5N1 or something else entirely?
That's a question we'll be exploring further in part 3 of our deep dive. We'll be discussing the broader implications of Dyadic's work and what it means for the future of pandemic preparedness.
Do you want a deep dive podcast like this? Contact Bull Run by Charlie DeVanzo.
Well, we've spent this deep dive really exploring, the potential threat of a bird flu pandemic. And honestly, it's been a little bit of a roller coaster. We went from understanding, how serious this virus is to learning about these groundbreaking technologies, like Dyadic International's C1 platform, which could really help us fight it.
Yeah, it is a complex issue with a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
But I think one thing that keeps coming up again and again is just how important preparedness is. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic, it really exposed a lot of weaknesses in our global health infrastructure. And we need to learn from those mistakes.
Yeah.
We have to do better next time.
Yeah, that makes sense. But what does doing better actually look like? I mean, what are the concrete steps that we need to take to be truly prepared for the next pandemic, whether it's H5N1 or something else entirely?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to prioritize pandemic preparedness. And we need to do it at a global level. That means investing in research and development, new vaccines, new treatments, but it also means strengthening public health systems and building these really robust surveillance networks. We need to be able to detect and track these emerging threats early on, before they even have a chance to spread widely.
So being proactive instead of reactive, it sounds like it's also about making sure we're using resources effectively. We saw a lot of missteps during COVID, like slow vaccine rollouts and inconsistent messaging.
You're absolutely right. Clear communication is essential, both from public health officials to the public and between countries. We also need coordinated action on a global scale. A pandemic anywhere is a threat everywhere, and we need to be working together, sharing information, resources, expertise.
That makes me think about Dyadic's work and how they're focused on making vaccines and treatments more accessible and more affordable. It seems like their C1 platform could play a big role in, addressing global health equity. And that would be a huge step forward in pandemic preparedness.
I completely agree. Equitable access to vaccines and treatments is absolutely crucial. We can't have a situation where only wealthy nations are protected while others are left behind. I mean, that's not only morally wrong, it's strategically unwise.
Yeah, it seems like there are a lot of big questions and challenges ahead. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you want to leave our listeners with? What should they be thinking about?
I think the most important thing to remember is that we do have the tools and the knowledge to effectively prepare for and respond to pandemics. We've seen some incredible scientific advancements like Dyadic's C1 platform, and we've learned valuable lessons from past outbreaks.
So it's not a question of capability then, it's a question of will.
Exactly. Will we as a global community make pandemic preparedness a priority? Will we invest the resources, foster collaboration, and take the steps we need to take to ensure a more equitable and resilient future?
Those are some powerful questions to consider. It's not just about the science, it's about policy resources and a collective commitment to protecting global health.
It is, and is a conversation that we all need to be a part of.
Thank you so much for guiding us through this topic. It's been fascinating and really important. This deep dive has definitely given me and hopefully all of our listeners a lot to think about.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about these threats, the better equipped we'll be to face them.
That's it for our deep dive this week. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. We'll be back next time with another fascinating exploration of the forces shaping our world.
Do you want a deep dive podcast like this? Contact Bull Run by Charlie DeVanzo.